Welcome to Soaring the Sky, Glider Pilots Podcast. Hello, my name is Chuck. I will be your host. This is episode 30. This episode is brought to you by Arizona Soaring Incorporated, the nation's largest provider of professional glider training. Since 1969, they provided training from initial private through CFI glider and entry level through advanced aerobatics. Open year-round, 7 days a week. More information is available at azsoaring.com. On this episode of the podcast, we head across the Atlantic to the English countryside and talk with John Pickard. John Pickard used to be a part of the Royal Air Force, where he was an aircraft propulsion mechanic. Also, while being in the Royal Air Force, he received training on hypoxia and ejection seat escape procedures. He also was deployed as a guard while being there in Bahrain during the Gulf War and can remember the Scud warnings. Years later, John has never lost his bug for aviation and has recently started to learn how to fly gliders. He is only 3 hours in, but loves everything about soaring. Later on the podcast, we're going to catch up with a previous guest, episode 14, with Clemens Ceipek, and he's going to tell us what he's been up to. He is also going to share his adventures flying his diamond distance. Also, we're going to catch up with him about his blog. All of this and more right now on Soaring the Sky. John Pickard, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you today.
Chuck, thank you ever so much for inviting me. I'm quite excited to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. When did your adventure in aviation get started?
I actually started being involved in aviation about 1983. I was at school, and one of my friends at school said, "I'm going to go to something called Air Cadets. Do you want to come along with me?" And that night I went away to the cadets, and I enrolled. Underage at the time, would you believe that they still let me go in? And I started my interest in aviation there.
What did you do at the Air Training Corps? What did that include?
Okay, back in the 80s, it wasn't quite as formulated as it is now, but we had a really good squadron, and we were involved in. We would go and have trips out to RAF bases for camps, and on these camps you get air experience flights, normally in aircraft like Chipmunks and Bulldogs at the time. And then during the winter months, we'd go away to day trips to Pacific airfields, and again have more flights in Chipmunks. At the time I was in, gliding wasn't something that was very much on offer in the area where I was based in the West Midlands at that time. But I did get a number of flights in military aircraft. And as a result of that, it sparked my interest in aviation, and I basically walked straight out of Air Cadets at the age of 17 and joined the Royal Air Force as an aircraft engineering mechanic at the time. I went away to training and learned how to be a propulsion mechanic, then was posted to a place called RAF Scampton, which is the home of the Red Arrows, who are currently displaying in the United States. And I worked there for 5 years in the line. And I was fortunate enough to get selected to be what was called a flyaway engineer. So I would go away with a pilot for a week in a jet provost or a Tucano, and we'd go to different air bases, and the pilot would go there to teach other RAF pilots basically how to spin, and it was a part of their yearly checks they had to do, because at the time they had Phantoms in the RAF and they weren't too keen on spinning those, so they'd take the jet provost or the Tucanos up there and we'd do that. And I have to say my flying skills at that time were very, very limited. I remember flying an approach to Lucas, and the pilot with me said, you have a go, we'll do a radar approach. And it was abysmal. I was left of centre line, right of centre line, too high, too low. I was all over the place. So, good times, but a long time ago now.
Yeah, but some good initial training, I'm sure.
Yeah, it really was. And you don't appreciate those starts you get in life and how things lead on until you get, I suppose, to the age I'm now. I'm considerably older. So my time in the RAF, I decided in the early 1990s, after becoming a technician, that the RAF future for me wasn't as bright as what it had been due to the cutbacks the government had at the time. So I left the Air Force and became involved. I didn't come involved. I joined the police service, became a police officer, and that's what I've done for the last 25 years. But even so, during this last 25 years, I haven't lost the bug for aviation. I've continued as an engineer at a number of airports and a number of volunteer projects just to keep my hand in, really. And also on the aviation side within the police service as well, being involved in that at times during my career. And that really has led me to coming to the end of my police career and thinking, is that bug still there? I really do want to fly. And I chatted it through my wife, and fortunately around June time this year, I lovely birthday present of some air experience flights in the glider.
Oh, very nice. So how was that?
It was absolutely scary. I'd forgotten how vulnerable you feel in a light glider, being towed and bumped around behind an aircraft, and not having control as well, and having somebody else fly you who was because you're in tandem obviously in a sphere, and it was really took a bit of getting used to. But once the first 3 or 4 minutes were over, it was amazing how the change in temperament and the change in age, I don't know what happened or everything, but maybe my learning styles changed over the years. And I felt like I really took to it, and I'm really hungry to learn and to learn quickly and to get on within the gliding community.
Why did you choose gliders over powered later on in years when you just recently got back into it?
For me, it was the purity of flying. Now, this is going to sound, I don't want to sound corny or anything like this, but I picked up, I like my podcasts, I like aviation podcasts, and I listened to a number of pilots, airline pilots, as well as fighter pilots, and they describe pilots who have been gliders of being stick and rudder pilots who have got a lot more skill than they have with powered. It was also a bit of a financial choice as well. The opportunity to glide and to enjoy it without worrying too much about the financial side was greater than that of learning to be a power flight. And I can't see where power flight at my age wouldn't take me into a new career where I could make the money back from what I've spent on learning to become a commercial pilot, something like that. But I could go to glide and enjoy gliding, and maybe as I get into it, actually teach and give something back to the younger people, because I'm not a natural at it, but I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that one. It's not so much going from A to B, but just enjoying the whole experience while you're in the air in a glider.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, actually, that I hadn't considered at the beginning, is the fact that you are thinking all the time. You can talk about the fact that, you're thinking about landing out and what field and all the rest of it, but you're looking at the weather. You're trying to decipher what the weather's like, which clouds are going to give you any lift if they are. Are you going to get into some street cloud and get some lift off that? How far back the wind's pushing you when you're in a turn? And you're there and you're trying to outsmart everything to keep your glider up in the air and to be safe. So I have to say, I enjoy that challenge.
So you had mentioned earlier about some of your goals with soaring. So you eventually want to instruct and teach others how to fly.
Yeah, it is something that I've done training qualifications in this job that I'm in now, and in a few weeks' time, would you believe, I'm retiring from this job, and I'm going into an engineering background where I'm going to be instructing young people in aviation industry, in aircraft design and aircraft engines, etc. And actually, I didn't realise until recently how much I really enjoy that. So to go back into it and to give something that I'm passionate about, the flying side of it, is something I really want to get into and to do. And I think that's come about because of being a police officer and meeting so many different people from so many different walks of life. A lot of the time, you don't get to see good in people, you only get to see bad. But when you do get to see good and you get to influence people, I've found that to be a real inspiration. And I've bumped into some of the young people along the way, years later, shall we say, who have actually found me out and come to say thank you. And yeah, I think to have that warm feeling inside and that smile on your face is something that I want to do in the gliding community as well.
And it only takes one person to make a change in somebody's life.
Yes. We hear that in politicians, we hear that in schools, etc. And it's not always people who you have in academic or in your parental side of it as well. So maybe it's not even it might not even be from the gliding that, somebody comes to the club and wants to learn to glide, or or whatever, but they have a mentor that you get speaking to them about other things in their life or directions or problems, etc. And they feel free to talk to you about. And I changed a great deal over the last 25 years. You know, I was a really young, naive man who came out of the Air Force and thought I knew everything. You know, in fact, I knew very little about real life. And some of those experiences now I'd like to pass on to people.
Now, backing up a little bit, you had talked about volunteering. You were doing some volunteering, I believe, with Cold War jets, right?
Yeah, this is a really interesting story. Facebook is a very powerful tool when it's used correctly, and I'd got in contact with some of my old sergeant from my RAF days, who was my line sergeant at the time, and he was involved with basically keeping a Lightning aircraft, the original, not the original P-38 Lightning, but the British Lightning, the English Electric Lightning, taxiing conditions, a place called Bruntingthorpe in Leicestershire. Well, that's about 30 odd miles away from me. So I had a conversation with him about whether, you know, they'd need any more volunteers, any more help. And he politely said no, which was a bit of a, oh, okay. But he said, well, I know a group who really needs some young blood. And when you're a man in your 40s that time, and somebody says that to you, it does make you think, young blood, where's this going? And I got involved. With the Canberra team. So we've got an English Electric Canberra. It's owned by four men who are considerably older than me, but they keep going. And so does the aircraft. The aircraft's over 60 years old now, and we fast taxi here at open days. And we have an ex-RAF squadron leader who comes down and does that for us. So for the last 4 years, I've been going down and nursing Avon engines into life, learning new systems about how the hydraulics work and avionics, etc. I mean, I was an aircraft engineer on Canberras in the Air Force, but only for a very limited time. And it's a very different setup when you can go to a storeroom and pick up parts. When you're dealing with aircraft that are now out of service and you've got no money to repair them, you have to learn to be inventive and creative in your solutions to problems.
Now, do they have plans to fly these aircraft, or are they going to be for museums? What are they doing?
Well, currently at the moment, there's around about 12 different aircraft, all in fast taxiing condition, and they range from things like VC-10s, Comets, Buccaneers, Lightnings, Jet Provosts, some Eastern European jets, a Venom, which is a very early British aircraft. There's no intention to fly them at all. The cost involved in getting them serviced, airworthy, passing the CAA checks. So here in the UK, since the disaster at Soar, where unfortunately people lost their lives during their display, regulations have really been tightened up around aircraft and their displaying, etc. And through working at Bruntingthorpe, I've picked up some work helping out at a place in Coventry where they have other vintage jets that do actually fly, and specifically around the Vampire aircraft. Speaking to the pilot and the owner of that, I wasn't aware of how much money it costs to keep that aircraft going and how much insurance is just to be allowed to go to an air show. And of course, a lot of air shows are charities, so they don't want to pay the aircraft or to give the aircraft owner any particular large sums of money to come or to cover their costs, etc. So it really is a game of passion to keep these aircraft flying, etc. So we won't get anywhere near getting the aircraft at Bruntingthorpe flying unless we get a really rich investor. And then, of course, you've got to find people who've got the skills and the time to bring them up to that level that's required to get them back into the air.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of work.
Yeah, you're talking years of work. I mean, the aircraft I work on particularly has been on the airfield for 25 years now and not flown. So you can imagine that's going to need a full major, I presume, to get that going, and NDT checks of spars and wing joints, etc., and a lot of replacement parts. And a lot of those replacement parts probably won't even be available anymore. You're going to have to get them specially made up to specific standards, etc. So, yes, even the UK, we had the Vulcan to the Sky project, and the Vulcan flew for a number of years. But even that aircraft now is ground running only, and that's due to lots of engineering issues they had.
If I can back up just a little bit more, now back when you were with the RAF, you did some training in hypoxia.
Yeah, as part of the role of being an engineer flying, etc., we had to go and do some of the pilot training, and that involved going to the compression chamber and going through the effects of hypoxia and how that affects your body and how to recognise it in yourself and in others. And I've also had some experience of this recently because I went on a trip to Everest Base Camp and around some of the passes in Nepal, etc. So while it's not been hypoxic as such, I've been walking up to 16,000, 17,000 feet myself in the last year, and seeing those effects is very interesting. And the training that the RAF gave us was top notch at that time. I mean, you've probably seen television programs about it and watched YouTube videos, and a lot of it's very true. You do very silly things, or you giggle at things, or you'll go off in one direction. And the worst part about it is that as the lack of oxygen for myself came on, it just felt so nice, and you just felt so lovely and so calm, and you don't appreciate what it's doing to your body.
Yeah, and even in gliders, of course, because, if you get in some good wave and you get up there in those altitudes, that's definitely something you have to recognize, and also have oxygen if you're going to go to those altitudes, because you don't want to get in that situation.
No, you don't, and you have to remember also that the time you're taking up to get to those altitudes, it can be quite rapid in some of the really good thermals. It's not like you're walking up as I did earlier, engineering wise. So that shock on the body, as it were, and the lack of oxygen to the brain, it affects your decision making processes. Yes, you might be able to recognise it in eyesight and blur around the edges, or the colour of your fingertips or something like that. But it's those decisions you make, and when you're soloing or even with somebody in a glider, you have to make some very wise decisions based on information. If you have to be able to process the information. So yes, you're right. The advantages of having oxygen on board and using that oxygen, because obviously not everybody will do, is very important.
Yeah, you get in a thermal and you get excited and you're going up, and yeah, it can happen fast if you're just concentrating on the thermal and how much altitude you're getting rather than lack of oxygen.
Yeah, that's right. The percentage of the air pressure, etc., reduces up there, and you'll feel those effects. And I've been hearing about people who've tried, who've had that effect on them, and they've opened the DV window and try and get more air in, etc., just to get them out of feeling that nauseous or that sleepy state.
So on your glider training, what are you flying now? What aircraft?
Well, I've been trying to push myself along a little bit. Actually, I've flown the twin Astia, as we call it over here, which is a 2-seat fiberglass glider. I've also taken quite a bit of time actually in a power glider in an SF25, and the reason for that is because we've had a very indifferent summer here in the UK. And would you believe, when you're at work, it's normally really good soaring weather. And when you're not at work and at the club, it's not always good soaring weather.
I know that's right.
Yeah, so even with aero tows, you're not always getting into any thermals or any street lift or anything like that. So using the power glide, it's given me the opportunity to practice some of the routines in relation to turning and to glide. So I was going to say to gliding, but to straight and level, and the use of air brakes and demonstrations, and especially around the stalling and spiral turns, and then be able to get back up to height and then re-practice, etc. If I was soaring without the motor, you'd be up and down, not always being able to guarantee getting any decent height to practice those things.
Yeah, lots of sled rides for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually got my logbook open in front of me, and obviously it's not going to be a great big logbook like other people have, but I had a 4-minute sled ride, as you call it, back in July. But then you say that even on a training flight a couple of Saturdays ago with an instructor, and we were doing stall demos that day, I had 46 minutes off an aero tow up to 2,000. And we lost 1,000 feet and we found 1,000 feet. And I was really pleased that the instructor allowed me. I just asked, says, well, can I have a go at keeping it in the thermal lane? I felt something when I'm flying. Can I have a go over here? And they were good enough to say, yeah, go on, then you do it. See, you have a go. And that gives you a heck of a lot of confidence, that because we're learning a program about how to fly a glider, how to trim, how to turn, etc. But there's not a lot in the program that says, teaching you how to soar and how to feel that the effects as you hit a thermal.
So how was that? How did you like that?
For myself, it was the fact that it was that little change in air pressure, the little popping of the wing up on one side or the other, and that feel, and having the variometer going beep, 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 at that time as well, that helps. And then having the confidence to look around you, then start your banking turn and try and nibble at that thermal where you are, and take into account the fact that the wind as well that's blowing you, so is that blowing you into the thermal, out of the thermal, having the confidence to come out of that turn slightly and then go back into it, and getting the most out of it. And it was challenging and it's hard work, but getting that 1,000 feet back on the altimeter was really worth it.
Yeah, it feels good for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been watching YouTube videos and footage, etc., and of all different sorts of things around gliding, because I thought I want to broaden my horizons and learn about this. And when I see some of the people out in Arizona or places like that, and look at the altitudes they're getting, we're not hitting anywhere near that. About 3,500 feet is my limit at the moment. But even so, at that height, in a little fiberglass aircraft, looking down on the patchwork countryside of the UK and the fields and the odd motorway and railway line going through, you do get that sense of this is so nice, this is so peaceful, and how far you can see and what's around you, etc.
Yeah, I agree with you. The view is amazing.
You've got that, I wouldn't say a 360, but you've definitely got a 270 view. And being the fact I'm gliding 25 miles away from my house, while I can't see my house, I can see features and think, I don't live far away from that. I can see that tower from here, or I can see, for example, we've got a power station that's not used, but it's still a feature because it's on the landscape. We've got a large hill that just was left there by the Ice Age retreating, hard piece of rock, etc. And things like that, it really makes you think and makes you look around and search for other, a bit of research around the local area as well. So that's really interesting. And I heard somebody talking at the club about the different types of soil and how the different types of soil in the area can affect your soaring performance and what thermals you get. And again, that just goes back to thinking of this is not a simple thing to do. There's a lot involved.
Yeah, the more you find out about how much is involved, it's definitely just everything, the weather, the landscape, all that.
And the other thing is that there's so much to learn on the ground as well. Not only is the DIing of the aircraft and the looking after the aircraft, but what there also is the helping with the launches, the retrievals, the whether that be a winch launch or whether that be another form of launch. There's so much to take on board.
Now, are you doing any winch launches at your club?
Yes, we've got two winches operating at the club, and I am told, although I haven't seen it yet, that they also have one of the international companies will occasionally come down and bring one of their test winches that they want to put through its paces, etc. So they're quite fortunate in that respect.
You know the altitudes they're getting off their launches?
Yeah, normally get 1,000, anything between 800 and 1,000 feet.
Okay, so it can be a pretty quick flight if you don't get anything.
Exactly, yeah. Hence my 4-minute flight, yeah. So if you're not, hitting the thermal, hitting something that's going to push you up, you're lacking really. I mean, I was down at the club this week, and because a lot of it's done by volunteers, there's so many people who put a lot of hard work and effort into keeping that club running, and I don't think it's always appreciated just how much effort it does take. That they were talking about the club's got 60 acres of land that needs mowing, for example. That's an 8 to 9 hour job just to mow the grass.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It takes a lot to keep a club going, Yes,
but I'm finding that because of that, the atmosphere is so lovely, and the people want to help you, they want to talk to you, and they want to see you progress, and that's the great thing about it.
And usually a lot of people around you have so much knowledge and so much experience that you can continually learn even when you're on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's all sorts of instrumentation fitted into gliders, etc. And just going through what's fitted and why it's fitted. We've got some of what I think is called flare, actually. and the anti-collision sort of stuff fitted. And I was reading about that this week, which is another thing that's really interesting. Sorry, it's called FLARM. My apologies. So that gives you an insight into how far away other aircraft might be by the types of bleed you get, etc.
Yeah, that extra safety device.
Yeah, because we're talking, earlier about the Air Force and whatever. Our club is about 25 miles away from an RAF station that has air experience flights, again, which was something I was doing 36 odd years ago. So we do see them come over our area. We see them come very close to the airfield, etc. So you need to have your wits about. You need to be seeing things. And of course, one of the things, it does take a while to get your eye in to be doing those lookouts.
Yeah, that's one of the questions I usually ask on the podcast is, how to be a safer pilot. And keeping your eyes open constantly scanning the skies is very important, especially if you're in near a busy airspace.
Oh gosh, exactly. We're not that far also away from the main helicopter training base for the joint services in the UK. And of course, helicopters tend to operate at low levels around the sort of heights that we're at as gliders. So tuning into their frequency and just picking up where they are, etc., and what directions they're heading on, it is very handy. But one of the lessons that I have taken on board quite a lot, but that's probably not the best use of English, but is around your lookouts and how you look and where you look, etc. It's no good just having your head on a swivel, as the old fighter pilot movies would show you and all that sort of stuff. It's being precise and sectioning off which areas you're looking at and then coming back and going away, etc. And I found that to be really beneficial because at first I couldn't see anything. I wasn't picking anything up until I actually learned how to look in sections, and that's been very good.
Now, I know you haven't had very many flights, but was there a particular time or a particular flight that just stood out that was a good experience?
Yeah, I really, really got a lot out of having the aircraft. We had an aero tow up to 2,000 feet. It wasn't a particularly great day for soaring, but it was good enough with the winds and whatever that we managed to get 40 minutes out over the countryside, which was really great because the visibility was fantastic. But for me, it was the fact of combining the stuff you practiced all together. So, for example, we'd done straight and level, we'd done turning, we'd done the use of the trim, we'd done the use of the air brake, etc. But it was that combination of putting all that together for the right reasons, and then the instructor saying to you or saying, I have control, and then putting us into a stall and, you get out of that, that sort of stuff. Having that confidence in you, the instructor having that confidence in you to allow you that opportunity to demonstrate that you had taken things on board and were now being able to use those in a practical sense rather than just an academic sense or just in a one solo or one dimension, as it were. John,
I appreciate you joining me today for the podcast. It's been really great talking to you.
Chuck, I've really enjoyed it as well. I felt at times, I'd like to be more up to date or up on the knowledge of how it all works. But I am really new to this, and I'm not just saying this to ring your bells, as it were. But your podcast has been really, really good for me. It's made me go away. It's made me research things. It's made me look at things in a different light. And I think anything you can get around aviation, and particularly around soaring at the moment for myself, is a great benefit.
Thank you, John. And speaking of information and soaking things up and getting everything you can out of soaring, our next guest we talked to, checking back with, Clemens Ceipek. He has a blog, Chess in the Air. He's going to tell us a little bit about that and about what he's been doing in the past few months. Clemens, great to have you back on the podcast.
Yeah, hi, Jack. Glad to be back. Thank you. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, I guess the last time you were on the podcast, it was back end of March or April.
Yeah, I think that's probably about right. Yeah, just the beginning of the season.
So how is everything going?
Yeah, I mean, we had from a soaring standpoint, we had a great season. I mean, the beginning of the year weather-wise wasn't all that great. There was a lot of snow this year in the Rocky Mountains. And all that snow in the mountains caused a lot of humidity in the air as the sun came out in the spring. And so we had a lot of more thunderstorms than we would usually have, especially in the May-June timeframe. But as the season progressed, it got better and better, and actually the August was particularly good, and even into early September was phenomenal. So overall, I'm quite happy with the season. Yeah.
Now, how has your blog been going? We had talked about that back when you're on the episode 14. You have a blog called Chess in the Air, and I believe the latest blog I was checking out was your diamond distance blog. How did that go?
Yeah. So I mean, we basically, I keep the blog for the same reasons I had it before, which is basically as a means to learn and to record my own lessons that I learned when I fly. And then to reflect on it and think about what I've done well and what I could do better next time. And I found that there's quite a few people who appreciate that and who read it and find something for them as well. So that makes me keep going, because it's not only for me now, it's also for others. So I think that's great. The diamond I did get my diamond distance in August. So this is, as I said, when you could finally fly full days and not be too constrained by thunderstorms at the end of the day. I made 6 attempts this year. I went out actually to a soaring camp in Nephi early in the year, and I tried twice at the Nephi camp, and I didn't get it at the Nephi camp, and then back in Boulder, I made another 4 attempts, and on the 6th one, finally, it worked out, where everything came together. You had the long soaring day, you had the high ceiling, you didn't have too much wind, because that can really mess the thermals up. And as I said, high cloud bases, strong thermals, and so a very good day. And it just all came together. And it was also fun because it was my first flight that was considerably beyond the Continental Divide to the west. And this is a big deal for people who learn to fly out of Boulder. Is you have this huge mountain range, which is just to the west of the airfield. And once you get over that mountain range, you're totally committed to the other side and to the conditions on the other side, and also being able to come back. I mean, the mountains you have to cross back over are 12 to 14,000 feet high. So you basically have to have good conditions to be able to come back. Otherwise, you're landing at an airport somewhere out on the other side.
Can you take me through that flight from start to finish and how that went, your diamond distance?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, basically got a good start early in the morning, relatively early in the morning, and I had a first turn point. So if you're in Boulder, I don't know if you know the geography. For anyone listening, if you think of the geography along in Colorado, after my early start, I had a first turn point near Pikes Peak. This is close to Colorado Springs. It's about 100. Not quite 100 miles, maybe 80 miles to the south of Boulder. And there's usually in the morning, there's often a convergence line. And there was a convergence as well. So it was forecast. It wasn't particularly strong that day, but it was definitely there and recognizable. It was marked too by curtain clouds, which is usual. And and then I had a friend of mine who was flying as well the same day, and we had not prearranged this. We just ended up flying the first leg basically together because he was trying to get to the top of Pikes Peak, which he hadn't been to before. So we ended up flying the first leg pretty much together, which was a lot of fun because in team flying, you can basically watch the other plane fly next to you a few hundred yards away, and you can see who's got the better line, and you can see who's climbing and who's not climbing, and then you basically adjust the course based on the other plane. It's basically just like flying with the birds. In this case, you're flying with another plane, and you're watching the other plane, and you see, how you are doing relative to them, and then you can adjust the course, so they can adjust the course accordingly. So So that was a lot of fun getting to the first turn point. Went pretty quick. Made the first turn point, and then the second turn point that I had, that was the one that was pretty far to the west, probably about 60, 70 miles west of the Continental Divide. So first of all, I had to find a good place to cross it. Again, you have to get pretty high up so you can cross over. And then at the morning, it was still relatively early, and the cloud bases weren't particularly high. So we still had, and so when I say not particularly high, they were around 16,500, which for Boulder is not very high, especially if you think of the mountains, as I said, between 12 and 14,000 feet. If you're at 16,000 feet and the mountainside 14,000, you're not very high above the ground, and the terrain is unlandable. So you have to be very thoughtful and mindful as to where and how you cross it. And so my first attempt, which was trying to follow more or less the straight line towards the turn point, that didn't really work out. So I got stuck on the west side of Mount Evans, and I was looking down into into the valleys beyond, so to Silverthorne, Dillon Reservoir, towards Kremling, and you could even see all the way to Kremling from that point. And Kremling was just a little to the east of my turn point, so I had to go beyond Kremling. But it just wasn't comfortable. So I did not make the jump at that point, and I almost gave up at that point on the task. I'm like, maybe 16,500 cloud bases just isn't high enough to go out west. So I detoured around Mount Evans, and that's a big mountain, right? It's one of the 14ers in Colorado. Detoured around Mount Evans, flew back to the Front Range, followed the Front Range up north, and then I spotted a cloud street that was going basically, a little south of my course, but more or less in the right direction. And also the base is lifted a little bit, and that's what happens usually during the day, pretty much at any soaring site, is that in the afternoon you get higher cloud bases. So cloud bases went up to above 17,000, just to about 17,000. And that was high enough, so I felt comfortable at that point with the cloud street going out, and I'm like, okay, I'm making the jump. So I did fly over the divide and kept going in westerly direction. I was just following the clouds. It was pretty straightforward. Not all of them worked, but you could. And I was, because I was flying over new terrain that I wasn't super familiar with. I knew I had researched my land out fields, and I knew where to land, and I knew the airports. Obviously, in the area, there's a few airports on that way. It's one of the more accessible places in Colorado from a land out standpoint. So I followed the route out west under the clouds and basically made it just beyond Kremling when the clouds stopped, and I had about another 10 miles to go, 10 to 15 miles maybe to go to the first turn point, and then there was hardly any clouds. So I tried to get as high as I possibly could under the last one, and then made the jump into the blue, flew out into the blue, made the turn point. The turn point was at a place called Toponas, and I was expecting a village there, and there wasn't really a village. There oftentimes isn't, even if it's called a village. There was just, if I could make it out, there was basically a street crossing and one or two houses. So that was my turn point. So made the turn point, flew back towards the clouds, and then it actually started. See, I lost quite a bit of altitude in that blue gap, but made it back fairly easily once I get back to the clouds. And they actually started to really perform pretty well. So it was now mid to late afternoon, and this is oftentimes the strongest part of the soaring day, and this was no exception. So there were a few clouds that just great lift, great climbs, so up to I think 10, 12 knot average, which isn't unusual for Colorado. It's on a good day you can find that, and there were a few of those in a row. So that the way out took a while, especially also it was into a headwind. the way back went pretty quick because now I had the wind in my back and I had very strong climb. So I made it quickly back to the divide. And then I had another turn point to the south and one to the north, but it was getting a little late in the day, even though I had made good time on the way back. And then I was very fortunate that there was a stronger convergence had developed and along the divide, and I was basically able to simply follow the convergence, and it perfectly aligned. This was a bit of luck. Obviously I'd read the weather forecast and I knew more or less what to expect when I picked the turn points that I picked, but it worked out almost perfectly. So. The convergence took me in straight flight to my third turn point, and from the third turn point took me to my finish turn point, which was about 20-25 miles north of the airfield. So just in straight flight made it to the finish turn point and had made my 500K, and then could just basically just climb back, glide back to the airfield. So it was a great flight. I was happy to get
Very
it on
nice.
my sixth attempt. Yeah.
What were you flying, Clemens, for that task?
Yeah, no, I was flying a Discus and just a Discus CS. So this is it's the first generation Discus. So not the current model, but it's still it's a very strong plane. It still performs very nicely. So it's about a glide ratio of 40-1, and you can. Typically, I would fly dry that day. I have not actually flown with water, so this is my next step is fly with ballast. But I flew it dry, and at dry, you basically fly it between 70 and 80 knots on good days for the most part between the clouds. Those are good speeds.
Now, how long was that flight? What did it take you?
The total flight ended up being quite long. It was over 7 hours. And the reason it took so long is because I spent so much time between my first turn point and my second turn point on the attempt to cross the divide. I probably lost at least an hour and a half on that stretch trying to cross the divide. So if you would look at my second leg on that flight, I think the average speed on that second leg is very slow. I would be surprised. I don't know actually off the top of my head, but I would expect it's probably around 40 miles or less, and that's very slow. And then coming back from the second turn point to the third and then to the finish, that was much faster. I mean, that was more than twice as fast for sure. But that's why it took so long, and that's why it got pretty late in the day at the end. Because I just had wasted so much time between the first and the second turn point.
Yeah, but you salvaged the flight because it sounds like you're starting to get low, and are you going to get across? You're starting to question if you're going to get across or not. So you slowed down, but you're able to do it. So that's awesome.
Yeah. I mean that's what makes it fun, right? If it had been all easy, it probably wouldn't be as memorable as it is when you had some challenges along the way.
Yeah,
sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then we had an awesome weekend. Like on I haven't written about this on the blog, but on September 2, we had probably the strongest soaring day of the year, but not even of the year. I would expect this probably was the strongest soaring day in a few years. It was just absolutely phenomenal. And we had, if you look at the flights out of Boulder, we had, the longest flight out of Boulder was flown that day by Peja Bogdanovic, who is one of our top cross-country pilots. He usually only comes out when there's a chance of getting 1,000K. And he flew 1,272 kilometers that day. And,
wow.
At an average speed of just under 100 miles an hour. So you can imagine how strong that day was. And, that included a triangle of more than 800 kilometers. So this wasn't just going yo-yo straight up and down a convergence line, which is probably the easiest way. I mean, there's no easy way to get 1,000K, but that is probably the easiest way to get 1,000K. But this was an amazing flight, and you had 10 pilots flying out of Boulder who flew over 500 kilometers that day. So it was a phenomenal day. I got 700 roughly. Oh, sorry, 600 kilometers. But I could have gone much longer. Unfortunately, my batteries died during my as I was heading south, and I don't want to fly without a transponder and without the FLARM along the front range, because there's so much air traffic coming over the Continental Divide into Denver, and so you don't want to fly without safeguards. So
safety first.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but it was still, I mean, this was phenomenal. It was just, you could basically all across Colorado, you could go, the cloud bases were over 20,000 feet. Most of the climbs were around 10 knots. You could go in any direction. There was no overdevelopment. There was no rain showers. There was no virga. There were no thunderstorms. There was hardly any wind. It was just, I mean, it was, if you could design a day it would basically, if you could design your own weather, that's the way you would design the weather. That's how it was.
Yeah, those are days you dream about having. You don't rarely see them, but man, you dream about those days for sure.
Yeah, you rarely see them, but when they show up, gosh, they're phenomenal. Yeah. Now this was spectacular, absolutely spectacular. And I almost made it to Nebraska. So I tried actually at a turn point. I had a task set for myself, and I tried to go to Nebraska. But that's the only area where there was basically no clouds. And again, I tried to go into the blue and see if I could climb somewhere in the blue, but there weren't any climbs in the blue. So I turned around, and as I said, all across Colorado, you could go pretty much anywhere.
Well, it sounds like you've had a great year for soaring, for sure.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and the good thing is everything safe, and there's nothing damaged. I think everyone in Boulder was flying safely the whole year, so it's always a good thing. A lot of good flights. So we had at the beginning of the year also as a club we bought a second discus, and we weren't sure how that would go. So now we have 2 disci, and both of them are in the air a lot. Even the last year we had a record with the one discus we had, which prompted us to buy a second one. And then this year, even though the weather wasn't perfect, the one that we had already from last year flew more hours than it did last year, and last year was a record. So and then the second one that we bought, that got a lot of hours as well. So I think we made a right decision as a club, and we're in a great position here for club members to fly great ships across awesome terrain in great conditions.
Yeah, what a good time to do it too, being the year that you've had.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we will definitely stay updated on your blog. It sounds like you've got an interesting one that you've given us kind of a sneak peek into, so we'll definitely check that out. Chess in the Air, right? Yeah,
chessintheair.com. Yep, playing chess in the air. That's what we do when we go soaring. We always have to play a game with Mother Nature, right? It's you basically think of the wind and the terrain and the sun and the how it all works together, and where you find the lift lines, and that's then you try and make the right moves. That's how you progress when you try and go cross country. So that's what it is.
That's right. Clemens, thanks for catching up with us. It's been great to talk to you again.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jack. I mean, it's great to be on the air again, and I think you're doing a great job with this podcast. I mean, it's been great. I've listened to all of the episodes. I think maybe not the last one yet, but everyone but the last one. And there's great learnings from different people that are on. There's lots of variety, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I'm having a blast myself, and I'm learning a lot. So you guys have been making it easy for me.
That's good.
It's always great to catch up with our guests who have been on the podcast previously and find out what they've been up to. Thanks again for joining us for another episode of Soaring the Sky. I greatly appreciate you hanging out with us today, and appreciate you listening to all the podcasts, all the episodes. And if you haven't listened to all of them, they are available on our website. That's soaringthesky.com. You can find all the episodes there. You can find our guest pilot page where you can see our guest pilots we've had on, some pictures of them. Also, while you're online, check us out on Instagram and Facebook, and both of those you can find it at Soaring the Sky Podcast. And as always, SSA.org, it is a great place for you to get more information about soaring and where you can take your first discovery flight right there, SSA.org. Have a great one. Hope to have you back here next time for another great guest right here on Soaring the Sky.